Hello and welcome to the Handplane Challenge. I'm Mark, your host, and I'm practicing to be the Russian judge just in case handplaning ever becomes an Olympic sport. You know the guy I'm talking about, the one who gives everybody a bad score? That's what we're talking about. At any rate, so today we're on part 2 of a two-part series on Autoset planes. As a reminder, an Autoset plane is a plane where you can take the cutter out, go off and sharpen it, bring it back and put it in the plane and more or less not lose your settings on the plane. The planes that we're featuring in this series are the Stanley G5C, Stanley gauge that is, and the Sargent 710. Now actually these are the only two planes that I know about that qualify for the term Autoset. If anyone out there knows of another one that fits this description, please leave a comment below. Okay, so what we're going to do here today is take some shavings, like we always do in the Handplane Challenge videos, but then we're going to test the Autoset feature by taking the cutter out, pretending like we're sharpening it, and then we're going to put it back in and see if we get the same cut on the second set of shavings. Okay then, let's start with the Stanley G5C. Now I wanted to do one little correction to the previous video. In the previous video I didn't have everything all assembled when we were doing the engineering details, and now that I've taken it out and used it, I realize that with the proper settings the mouth opening is really pretty normal. It's not so narrow. Unlike the Sargent 710, which really and truly does have a extremely narrow mouth, this one is pretty normal. Okay, so we're going to start by taking some shavings. A little bit light. Seems like we have somehow gotten just a little bit out of lateral adjustment there somehow. I'm not quite sure how. Now we're a little too deep. Trials and tribulations of a handplane user. Pretty good. I think we're still just a hair. Try it again. I fiddled with it there a little bit. Now it needs to be a little more depth. Went too far because that's too thick. Holy smokes. Yeah, that's not too bad. It's about in the right place. I'm not sure I have all the settings in exactly the right place. Yeah, fairly thin shaving, fairly wide, mostly the length of the board. Yeah, it'll pass for now. Okay. Now, testing the Autoset feature. Lever cap out, cutter out. We're going over to sharpen it. We're pretending like we're sharpening it. We've completed sharpening it. And now we're going to put her back in and see how it works. Okay. Actually, that was not bad at all. Once I finally got it adjusted from the first shavings, it's now, I'd have to say that pretty much reproduced the yeah, I don't think we can do much better than that. Slight lateral adjustment there, pretty close to the middle of the plane. Nice and thin. It's hard to argue with that. I have noticed in previous testing that the tightness of the lever cap screw will affect the outcome of this test. We're going to tighten this one just a little bit. That was a pretty thin shaving, so tighten just a little bit. Beautiful. That did make a little difference, as we had seen previously. Okay then. So that's the Stanley G5C. It took a good shaving, and frankly the Autoset feature worked pretty good. Onward to the Sargent 710. Okay. Now let's test out the Sargent 710 Autoset plane. As I said in the previous video, the mouth on this plane is extremely tight. I've got here a 13 thousandths feeler gauge, and that is about the size of the mouth. It is extremely narrow. So let's take the first set of shavings. Okay. Seems like I got a little low spot right around here somewhere. That's all right. We're taking a good shaving, nice and wide, mostly the length of the board except for that low spot. I'm going to back it off just a little bit more. See if we can't get just a little bit thinner shaving. I think that's about as good as it's going to get. Working well though, taking a good shaving. Now, let's test it out for Autoset capability. Remove the lever cap. Cutter is out. We're off sharpening it now. Not really, but pretend like we are. Come back from sharpening, put it in the blade and the plane. Lever cap back in and tighten it down. Now let's see what happens. Okay, well, we've gone into what I like to call resaw mode. Taken a good shaving, but it is pretty thick, so it did not go exactly back into the same plate, into the same setting. Now, what we saw on the Stanley was the tightness of the lever cap screw seemed to make a pretty big difference. So now we're going to loosen that. Yeah, that was more like the first set. In fact, pretty decent. Bearing in mind the idiosyncrasies of the board here, I think we're doing pretty good. Maybe. Yep. So there you have it. So we've tested the Stanley G5C self-setting plane and the Sargent 710 Autoset plane. In general, the Autoset feature seems to work. I would say that it doesn't go back perfectly identical, but because, you know, it does seem to be sensitive to the tightness of the lever screw, which you just can't perfectly reproduce from one time to the next. But that's easy to fiddle with, at least. And so my overall conclusion on the Autoset feature, if I were giving it a grade, I'd give it a B. It's not A, but not failing either. So I'd say that's a pretty solid B on whether the Autoset feature works. Okay, I was all set to go ahead and publish the shavings test for the two Autoset planes. And then I said to myself, wait a minute, we really ought to try this test on a non-Autoset plane. So I went to the shelf and grabbed the trusty old Stanley Bailey number 4. You've seen this in previous videos, so it's a well documented piece of hardware. And so we're going to try the same test with this one. Here we go. Alrighty then. As I said in the previous video, this is a fine planing hand plane. Not going to do anything to that. That looks pretty darn. We will try to keep it from flying away from the fan. There we go. Okay, lever cap off. Off to the sharpening station. We've seen this shtick before, so we're not going to go into it too much. Now, I think this will only work if you can manage somehow to sharpen this thing with the chip breaker still attached. I don't know how many people do this. I'm always in the habit of taking the chip breaker off when I sharpen. If you have to take the chip breaker off and try to reproduce setting that chip breaker back from the edge, I don't see how you could put it back on and get the same shaving. But if you can manage to just hone it, or whatever you would be doing, this would be the working part of that. If you can manage to hone it, maybe it'll still work. Alright, so we're done sharpening. Back in, lever cap down. Get it so you can see. Okay, Stanley Bailey, part 2. Yeah, that is real darn similar. Let me do it one more time just for kicks. Just right. Absolutely as good as either of the two Autoset planes. Congratulations, Stanley Bailey users. You're all now proud owners of Autoset planes. Tongue in cheek. I originally picked the two planes for this test, the Stanley Gauge and the Sargent Autoset, based on their own advertisement as, you know, Autoset type planes. The Gauge plane is referred to as a self-setting plane, but it's really the same thing. And it was only after I got through most of the testing that I thought that I didn't really know what really defined an Autoset plane. So clearly, I now understand it better. The tests have been illuminating in that respect. The sort of defining characteristic of these two planes are, one, that they have some positive setting for the depth adjustment. For example, in the Sargent, the pin here fits tightly in the hole in the cutter, and that is a very narrow window for depth so that it can go back to the same setting after you sharpen it. But the second characteristic is that they've moved the chip breaker function away from the cutter and onto the lever cap. So you really sort of need these two things. A tight control of depth adjustment and a chip breaker that is not dependent on the cutter, not fastened to the cutter in any way. So those two things are what makes an Autoset plane. And the reason that the chip breaker can't be with the cutter is that you have to be able to sharpen it. Now, the Sargent is fantastic in this respect. It comes out as a single a cutter with nothing attached to it. This is perfect. It's a great design. Gauge is not quite so good. They've got the mechanism for controlling the depth, but this bracket here is definitely, it's fine if you're a freehand sharpener, but it's no good if you use honing guides. You know, I've got several Eclipse, Stanley, Veritas, and with this bracket on here, none of them are going to allow it to work. So technically an Autoset plane, but definitely not as good a design as the Sargent. As we saw, even the Stanley might somewhat qualify. Maybe we can call that a gray area. Because the Stanley, you know, the lever, the depth adjustment is manipulated by this lever here attached to the yoke, and you know that stays put when you take the cutter out. It's a little looser than either of the Autoset planes, so we managed to get it to work well, but that might have been a lucky go of it. But you know, you have to be able to sharpen with the chip breaker in place, which some people won't, you know, it's just, some people just won't like that. You know, even if you are a freehand sharpener and you want to leave the chip breaker in place, you have to be able, you're not going to do anything about any burrs that form on the other side of the cutter. So maybe you can call that an Autoset. Maybe it's a gray area. I don't know. It's worth thinking about. Maybe it really is a second cousin of the Autoset planes. So we've got Autoset planes, and we've got planes that might be considered a gray area. There are definitely planes out there that are not Autoset planes. For example, in a plane that we've seen in a previous video, here's the infill smoother. When you take the blade out to sharpen it, you're going to have to reset it when you put it back in. There is nothing about it that keeps the blade, registers the blade in a certain location when, you know, while you've taken the blade out for sharpening. So there are planes that are just absolutely not included in the category. Okay then, let's wrap it up and present our conclusions on the two planes that are the subject of this video series. As I've said, probably alluded to previously, the Stanley G5C had some design features that I wasn't wild about. One is the depth adjustment lever is limited. It's a little clunky to use. Another is the chip breaker is a sort of thin plate underneath the lever cap. It's and that by itself isn't necessarily bad. It's just on this design, it's pretty hard to get that chip breaker, to get that plate moved down to, you know, a 32nd of an inch away from the edge of the cutter. So it's, you know, what I ended up deciding was you pretty much have to have the lever cap almost tightened down before you set the chip breaker to be close to the edge. It's doable, but it's not great. Thirdly, you know, there's no actual lateral adjustment on this, although it wasn't as bad as I first thought. You don't have the bracket here is the screw that tightens it down is accessible with the plane assembled. You don't have to crank it down real hard, it'll stay put. And so if you've got it modestly tightened down, you can literally grab the edge of the sides of the cutter and move the cutter back and forth to get
lateral adjustment. As I said before, these holes here are slotted. Apparently my inference here is that they decided to make it that way so that people could do that. That's my, if somebody knows differently, by all means leave a comment. And lastly, as we just said, you know, it's not as good an Autoset as the Sargent, because the bracket on the cutter won't allow for all forms of sharpening technique to be used. On the other hand, we have the Sargent, which has, in my opinion, just a well thought out design. I like that the chip breaker is part of the lever cap. It's solid. It's easier to see. It's still not great. I mean, you have to look very closely because you have to set the chip breaker while the plane is assembled and look down into the mouth. This is not a great system, but it's doable. It has the actual lateral adjustment, where an elegant design, because the lateral adjustment moves in this slot so that it's pretty much independent of depth adjustment. And the depth adjustment lever, because they thoughtfully made the cutter narrower up here, it's a lot easier to adjust the depth with this one. If I had one knock on this plane, it would be that the mouth opening is extremely tight, 13 thousandths of an inch. And there's no, of course, these are all fixed frog planes, so there's no adjusting it. The mouth opening is what it is. So that's great for a smoothing plane, but frankly, you're not going to be able to take thick shavings with it, I think. I didn't really try that. If somebody knows differently, please leave a comment. But with that narrow a mouth opening, if you try to take a thick shaving, I can't imagine that it's not going to clog up in the mouth. So that's it. Basically, in the competition between the Sargent 710 and the Stanley G5C, I like the Sargent. I think the Sargent is a better plane. Thank you for watching the Handplane Challenge. If you like this video series, please consider subscribing. If you like these particular videos, please leave a comment down below, and with questions, comments, or anything else that you'd like to add to the discussion. And we'll see you next time on the Handplane Challenge.